Hey everyone, Para here with my Blender 2.8 Rigid Body Physics Path to Mastery series. This series is for me to share all the things I've discovered so far on my journey learning Blender. I've personally learned through trial and error, forums, the Blender manual and other tutorial videos. I will be covering as clearly and concisely as I can rigid body physics, properties, menus, pitfalls, and how to fix them with worked examples. The goal isn't to make any particular scene to render out, but instead demonstrate the overarching concepts I've found important. If I had learned these concepts from the start, I would have saved myself a ton of time randomly testing settings to get a shoddy simulation. I hope this video helps with others within the open source community avoid the early frustrations I faced. Please note that if you're just starting to learn Blender, this may be a difficult tutorial for you to follow along. Apologies in advance for any mistakes. I've added correction annotations where I've spotted them. Please note that this is my first Blender tutorial video and I'm still building confidence on the microphone, so please bear with me as I keep improving my productions. By the end of this video, I'll have covered the necessary skills and techniques to get a similar result as the current rendered background. I'll also go over a quick example to solidify some of the techniques that I find most critical for developing a rigid body physics simulation. If you know of alternative methods or solutions, feel free to share them in the comments. And finally, the timestamps and any links that I mentioned will be in the video description below. With all that out of the way, strap in and let's begin. So I'm using Blender 281 Beta. And just start off with a general file, and we don't need these default items, and it's important to save your file so that the cache is going to be saved out of memory. Alright, so we want to add this menu to our quick favorites, so just right click and add to quick favorites so we can access that in object mode. Alright, and now we've just used Q. Oh, sorry, I'll just bring up my screencast keys. So Q to access this menu. The main menus we're going to be looking at is this rigid body menu and the scene properties, rigid world, and then for our objects with our physics context menu, rigid body. See our rigid body world is not populated and we can add it manually here. Or when we add in an active or a passive rigid body, it'll automatically populate right there. It's created a collection for our rigid bodies automatically, and we can see that in our object context menu under collections, and here it is. So if we start playing, let's just drop this down to 50 frames. So this is going to be participating in our physics simulation now. If we remove this collection, you'll see that it's no longer in that participating in the physics. So we can just add that back in like so, and that's set up automatically. Alright, so a lot of this information is from the online manual, so just right click and have a read through there, and it's quite extensive. So this constraints collection is similar to our rigid body world, except that's going to be for our physics constraints such as hinges and pivots. We'll be getting into that later. Speed is the simulation speed. If we drop that down to 0.1, that's going to be like bullet time. This is keyframeable, so we can animate this to get a slow motion effect. Before we go any further, you need to know in your output settings, frame rate is very important here. If you get to the end of your project and you want to make it smoother at 60 or 120 FPS, that's going to cause a lot of problems. So you want to do that at the start of your project. So 60, or I'm just going to go 30 to match my OBS recording. Okay, so back into our scene properties. So we just covered the speed. Split impulse is for reducing the velocity of high speed collisions between objects. So if you're getting bizarre spin-off objects just accelerating away from each other upon collision, that might help. And it's also noted in the manual that it can assist with stacking objects. This is a quick side example to show the split impulse off and on. So I've created a stack of cubes with bad geometry which is intersecting, which causes them to explode, but it demonstrates well the split impulse. So with it off, it accelerates away as you might have encountered before. And then when we turn it on, you can see how it clamps the acceleration of the objects. Alright, so these two are very important. Steps per second is the number of physics calculations per second. So this is related to the speed and the frame rate of your animation. So if your speed goes up to twofold, you're going to need to go up twofold in your steps per second to have the same accuracy. And note that 60 and 10 are the lowest it goes by default. You can go lower by typing it in, but that's not recommended because it's already going to be causing clipping issues at these low resolutions. Consider it a preview or a draft speed, and you want to increase this to get better results later on. for argument's sake, let's say we have 30 steps per second, and we have a cube coming to intersect this one, frame 1, and then it's traveling this way, and frame 2, it's traveled into here, and this steps per second is evaluating 30 times per second, and our frame weight is 30 times per second. So between frame 1 and 2, this has gone inside another physics object here. And when these meshes collide, the rigid body physics is going to try and correct that by ejecting one from the other. So this is when you get the explosion effect. So we fix this by increasing our steps per second. So let's say we increase it several times and we get these in-between calculations. Okay, so we have one calculation, two, 3, 4, and so these are our steps per second physics calculations, but this is still frame 1, and this is still frame 2. There you can see that it's going to intersect with other geometry less often with this higher resolution. So at this point, it's going to go, hey, we have a physics collision here, we need to evaluate this collision, and it'll perform much more as expected. So let's keep that in mind. And we'll be doing some examples later on. So let's just clean up my annotations here. Here's a quick side example to demonstrate how meshes are ejected from one another when they're intersecting. This is a quick example to show one of the common issues caused by having this steps per second too low. So these are traveling down at some velocity and they actually travel through the mesh before the next calculation. So I'll just demonstrate that. So this one's okay, but the top one has higher velocity, so it just travels straight through. So we can easily correct that by increasing the steps per second to say 120. And you'll see that's fixed right up. Solver iterations is similar to steps per second, but it's for the physics constraints, so your physics joints, hinges, pivots, etc. We're going over that later on, but it's also recommended for stacking stability, so if you have lots of physics objects stacked upon each other. So the cache is just like any other cache in Blender. So we set the start and end frames, so we have 50 here. Just got some info about how many frames are in memory, and this can be visualized in your timeline, so you need to pay attention to these color codings along your timeline. So the very pale bar is uncached, and this lighter one is cached just in the viewport. So as you play it back, you'll see it's caching the playback, and then when we get to the end, that's fully cached and calculated. So we can save that calculation time that we just did. We can bake it to the cache, and now that's been saved. So that saves you having to recalculate it if you've already done the calculation in the viewport. And if we're going to want to change anything, add another cube. So this is a active, so it should be in the simulation, but it's not. What's going on? Well, it's not part of the baked cache, so we're going to have to delete that and either run it again in our viewport, or we can click bake and it'll be updated. But Blender can be a bit finicky and it doesn't always update the physics, so we're going to have to force it to update. So we can just move this a little bit and maybe undo it, bake it again, and now it's forced it to reevaluate the scene physics. So I'm sure there's many ways to get it to force an update, but I just do it like that. And all the rest of these are pretty self-explanatory. Bake all dynamics are going to be for any other physics simulations in your scene. Delete all bakes, it just does that exactly. And update to frame is if you have a very long simulation and you don't want to do the whole thing, you can just bring it up to frame 30, calculate the frame, and now it's done that calculation for us. If we're going to bake it, it's still going to do the full length. I don't really use that option. Alright, so field weights. So this has got a local gravity option, and you should use this rather than your world settings because it's going to affect all of the world gravity. Okay, But if you want low gravity just for your rigid body, you can pop it down here and you can see it taking effect there. I don't know how to keyframe this, but if you know, just say in the comments. Okay, so the effector collection is if you have any force fields in your scene, you can put it into that collection. So I'll just do a quick example. So here's a force field and a wind. I think I clicked the wrong one. So I want wind, and let's just push that force up to something that we'll see very easily. Alright, so you can see that's affecting our scene as we would expect, but let's say we have another force field affecting another system and we don't want them to interact. We can change this one to our effector collection, and then in our rigid body we can change our effector collection to that one. So this one is, this force field is in our collection, so it's pushing, and this one is not, so it's not included in the effector collection. And we can locally, sorry, I'll just delete that annotation. Then we can locally change these forces just like so, and they just impact exactly what they're named, so wind, etc. I'll just uncheck that now so we don't get any unwanted results later on. Alright, so that's the majority of our settings for the scene tab. Most of the rest of the video is going to be on the physics tab and this menu here. So the two main objects are of course the active and the passive types. Passive are going to be your stationary objects such as your floors and walls. So let's go ahead and add in a floor and just add in a passive. And note that menu is just going to be the same as adding it here. And we can see that it's behaving a bit oddly, like it's bouncing around, and apply a scale to that, it might help. But you can see it's falling through the mesh. And that's due to some settings we'll cover in a minute. So starting with our active object, we have the mass here. So this is important for different objects with physics are colliding, and we can automatically calculate this from our rigid body menu, calculate mass. And so this is based on the volume of the shape. So if we choose an acrylic, we can see that it's changed our value here. And similarly, if we choose a cardboard, once again, it's different. Dynamic is whether it's going to participate in the simulation. So if we untick this, it's essentially not a physics object anymore. Right? So what you'd want to do is, if you have a tower and you don't want it to start falling until frame 100 or 30, we would just keyframe animate this. So it's off, and then turn it on for the next frame. So it's going to just stay where we want until the appropriate time in our scene. And the other time this is useful is you combine the dynamic with the animated. So the next option is the animated. I'll just delete those keyframes and leave it on dynamic, so it's simulating. So animated means that it's controlled by the Blender animation system, so your timeline keyframes, and it's not going to be participating in the physics simulation. This is useful for providing a short animation. Oh, let me just create a separate item here. Alright, so bring it up to frame 4, and we'll just give it a bit of velocity. Alright, so this velocity is remembered in the physics system, and we toggle between animation and physics. So we're going to have animated ticked here, and then frame 4, we're going to untick the animation, and it's going to remember this velocity and then pass it over to the rigid body physics. So this is going to be flying off under the rigid body now. And we can see it. But if we have this in our animation system, it's not going to behave as expected. Alright, so through the animation portion, it's just going to ignore other physics objects, and then when we hand it off, it'll collide like normal, because now the rigid body physics is controlling the motion. Okay, so these next settings are going to be quite important ones that you'll want to mess with quite a bit. So the shape is the shape of the collision mesh formed around our object. So Convex Hull is a simplified method and gives you fast results. So I'll just pull up the manual here because it explains it best. Convex hull, a mesh-like surface encompassing, e.g. shrink wrap all over the vertices. Best results with fewer vertices. A convex approximation of the shape has good performance and stability. So this is why people run into problem, because it's a convex only approximation. I'll show exactly what that means. Let's just set up a few more objects. Set this one to passive, and we'll have this one falling into it. Our scene hasn't updated, so we'll just have to, sorry, it's not that bug, it is because this is checked on animated. So now this is participating as we would expect. All right, so let's just create a convex shape quickly, something like this. Okay, so we'd expect that to fall into the gap, right? And it's not. That's because the convex is going to shrink wrap right around here, and that's going to be a collision model, because this is a concave shape, and that's just not going to be the way that it's colliding. And I don't know how to visualize the collision model. If you know, please let me know. So what we need to do is change the shape from convex to the mesh. So this is going to form a collision model that wraps around our model properly. And we'll see that it falls in nicely. All right, and now it's a bit jittery and stuff. This comes back to our resolution for our physics. So this is very low right now. So we'll increase that up to 60 and we'll get better results straight away. And the faster your objects are moving, essentially the higher you're going to need these to be, as I showed at the start with the annotation pen. The source is the source of the collision mesh. So this is going to be the initial shape of your model. If you have shape keys, etc., you're going to need to put it on deform, and final is after all modifiers, as it says right here, and deforming will need to be on to allow it to deform during simulation, as it says right there. I haven't used this much, so I can't tell you more than that. Surface response is pretty straightforward. Friction, so slippery, very slippery at 0, and kind of grip like rubber at 1. So if we put it up to 1, you'll just see that it's not going to slide as much. And it's just really slippery at 1. Bounciness, just, you know, elastic collisions. But if you put it up and you're not getting the results, look, it's not bouncing. What's going on? Well, this one has a bounciness as well, and this is set to 0. So 0 times anything is pretty low. It's 0, so we need to put this up to 1. Now we're getting a bounce that we expect. So let's just bring this down to reasonable numbers. Now sensitivity is very important. This is the offset of your collision mesh from your base mesh. Okay, so you need to read the manual quickly, and it has some guides here. Okay, so the margin, threshold of distance near the surface where collisions are still considered. Best results when non-zero. Right, so it's used to improve the performance and stability. Behaves differently for different shapes. Some shapes embed it. So the margin is embedded for these basic shapes. So sphere box, you should be using those when possible, and it's not embedded for, look at that, our mesh, which we want to use. But this offset can be annoying, so you can visualize that better by increasing the margin, and that's just going to push that mesh right there. So you can see that. So if we bring that very close to 0.001, that's going to tighten it up a lot. So you can put it to 0 and it can be fine, or just use it at a very low number. Oops, clear my pencil. Okay, and collections are your physics collections. Only objects in the same collection will participate or interact with each other. So if this is in collection 2 and this is collection 1, they do not interact. But if this one is now in 2, so they're both in 2, bam, it works just as you'd expect. So this is just a way to sort your rigid body simulation. That was the passive rigid body settings. Now the active settings are very similar with a few small changes. So as we said, the main difference here is the dynamic. This is for toggling it on later on. Passive doesn't have that because it doesn't move with gravity, etc. So the dynamics tab is the next main one that we want to look at. So this is the dampening of the translation and the rotation. So translation is just linear motion in XYZ. So this is going to fight gravity now. So You can see it's resisting motion in the Z direction. So if you're having an object running into honey or something, this might be fun to play with. And this is keyframeable, so we can adjust that on the fly to get slow motion action. And rotation is the same thing. So energy dampening on rotation. So you can see it's not even spinning here. Now deactivation is a very cool one that you might find useful. So start deactivated. This is for your active objects only, and it hasn't updated our simulation. So just move that and then undo it. All right, so what's going on here? So this is a live recording, so we can just troubleshoot it together. Start deactivated, dynamic. Let's just try moving it. All right, I think it was interacting with the mesh, collision mesh somehow. All right, so we've got the scene to update the physics now. So start deactivated means that the physics aren't being run on that object until another physics object interacts with it. So if we have another cube that falls onto this one, when they collide, this will have the physics turned on and it'll start participating in the scene. There we go. So if you have a stack of cubes awaiting to be struck by anything, you can use this to activate them. It's very useful for holding things steady when they should be. These two settings I have not been able to get to work, but I'm pretty sure what they're for is, say you have an explosion and all your pieces are flying out and they slow down on your surface, your ground. You want to increase your performance by stopping the calculation of the physics on those objects when they're very close to zero velocity. So these are meant to be the linear and angular cutoff velocities for them to become deactivated from the physics system. I haven't been able to get it to work, so please let me know if it's a bug or if I'm using it wrong. The next area we want to deep dive into is the rigid body menu. So we've already covered add passive, add active. That's the same as using this menu. Remove is actually just going to be the same as checkboxing right here. So it's going to remove it from the rigid body physics. Change shape is the same as changing the collision shape right here. So if we change the shape to a capsule, you'll see it update right there. Calculate mass we've already covered. All right, so copy from active is an important one. Run a quick example over here. All right, so let's say we want to set all of these to be active, and we set this one up, and well, what happens? They're not all active physics objects. So this is our active. We can hold shift to change the active. You can see by the highlight rim. So now we can copy the physics from that active object. So this is the one we applied the setting to. Now all of them you can see have the setting applied. All right. And what if we just want to remove it like so? Now another trick is to simply hold Alt, and this will apply to all of your selection. And so they should all be active now. And it's not, of course. There we are. So I just held Alt while I added it in that menu. So what if I want to change the convex hull to box? Just again, hold Alt and select it, and it should update in all of our items. Or you can use the copy from active menu item. So apply transformation is if you want to save position in your simulation. So let's say it's fallen down to here. You're like, wow, that's great. All right, let's save it. Apply transformation. Now we go to the start. It's set that as a home position. So if you're scattering objects around your scene, like marbles or whatnot, and you want to save it, apply transformation, and then perhaps remove the rigid body physics to save that location. Okay, so to bake the keyframes is a destructive process. It's going to remove that object from the rigid body physics. It's going to keyframe that entire motion. So it's no longer going to participate in the physics simulations, but this is going to allow you to export it to other programs to see that physics simulation now as an animation. So I'll do it for this one right here, and we'll just go baked keyframes, and we'll set up the frames that we want, end and start, that looks good. We can see in our timeline it has now applied it to just our selection. So it's going to look exactly the same, but it's actually not going to participate in our simulation as you would expect anymore. So this is just being animated, and this is actually still part of the rigid body physics. Make a backup copy of your scene if you're going to be doing that. It's my recommendation. All right, the last one is connect, and this is for our physics constraints. So let's do some examples of that now. A good example is connecting these. If we parent these, it's not going to give the result that we expect. Let me just fix this up. Normally these would be jittering and not very happy about being parented. So you can just give odd results. So what we want to do instead is use a physics constraint. So we'll go into our menu and connect, and this is going to automatically create an empty and apply the rigid body constraint to it with the type fixed by default. So this is basically gluing them together. And this is the recommended way to connect them if you're not going to join them as a mesh with Control J. So I'll just show you one other option, which is the hinge. And this is very axis dependent. So we can see our limit angle Z. So we know that it's around the Z axis, RX 90. And now we have the Z axis here acting as the hinge. So I can't really visualize it very well as I'm both active. So just change this to passive. Now we should have like a swinging hinge situation. There's a great video that goes into depth on all of these different constraint types, so I'll link that as well. Alright, so I'm just going to do a quick recap of all the main important points. So the main menu items in object, rigid body, set your frames per second before getting to the end of your project, otherwise you'll be stuffed. And then you have your scene properties, rigid body world, steps per second and iterations are on draft preview settings initially, so don't be scared to turn them up. And then under our physics tab, we're really going to need to change the shape and the collision margin to suit your needs. I think maybe just a quick example and we'll be done. So I'll just do a classic setup here with the cubes. Actually, let's do a stack of dominoes because I think that's just a bit more interesting. Alright, people love to use the array, so we'll just pop that onto the Z-axis. Alright, we're going to need to apply that and create its own geometry, so I'd like to make a new... Just going to need to separate this by loose parts, and the origins are all here, so we'll just fix that quickly. Whoops, wrong setting, origin to geometry, and then make them all passive. And this is what you're going to encounter. It's not working properly, so let's just show you how to fix that up. Now this is falling through the base mesh, and that's because of the collision mesh is not what we want. So convex hull on this one should be fine. It's a very simple shape, but this should be set to box. And you'll see that that's going to tighten up the mesh a lot better, like so. And we want that to be applied to all of them. So that's our active object. We just do copy from active, and now they are all much happier. So this is where the understanding of how it works is just going to save you so many hours down the line. And it's still going to be wobbly. So let's just extend this out a bit. And we're going to need to change that simulation to match. Alright, so it's still wobbling and it's going to fall over. Recapping the ways to fix this, we can A, start this untick dynamic and keyframe it when we want it to start falling over. Start deactivated, and when we whack it with a ball, it'll then become activated. Or we can set the simulation start further down the line in our scene. Alright, so let's just do some of those. Simulation start is simple, just drag it across. It's going to be global though, so it might not work for you. Alright, so let's just get our impact ball ready. So we want to give it some initial momentum and smash it into there. Let's just turn on the keyframing. Alright, so we've got it running now, and we want to change this curve type to linear so it's not decelerating at the end of our arc. Alright, so we just make this inactive, and it's animated. This frame is when we want it off, and frame before is when we want it to be on. So the physics simulation is going to take over, and bam, look at that, we're already away. Well, this is kind of boring because we just only have one stack, so simple, we'll just increase that. Now we're going. Now we're cooking. So this ball isn't impacting very hard, and that's because it's got default mass. So if we increase that 10 relative to these are set to 1, so it's a 10-fold increase, it's just going to obliterate them. And what about this deactivated? Well, we can start it deactivated, and therefore they won't be wobbling at all. So let's just push this right to the end so that we can see that it's going to be stable until we need it to explode. And I think I've only applied it to one object. That's my bad. Forgot to hold Alt and click to apply it to everything. Alright, so I'm causing myself some issues here, so I should just use the copy from active. That way it's going to apply exactly what I want. So you can see they're rock steady now, and it's going to activate as soon as that hits. Let's extend it out a bit more so we can see our scene. Alright, and what about some slow motion? Easy. We can just keyframe this. So let's find our impact point, and let's get some slow-mo happening right here. So we'll just keyframe down to 0.24, and now it's going to be regular speed. We're going to need to recache this, so run from the start of, and we can see we have slow motion. And if we just want to quickly pretty up our scene, that's easy. We can just turn on shadows, cavity, just change this to texture, or random, sorry. So we can just quickly visualize what we're doing. Alright guys, so that's about it for me. Please let me know if this has helped, and I'll provide links to everything that I can that I mentioned. And also the cell fracture add-on is a bunch of fun and has tons of uses with the rigid body physics. So I was thinking of doing a video, an in-depth tutorial video on that as well. So please let me know if you'd like that. Thank you so much and have a good one. Hey guys, I've got some final tips here. So your object sizes should be as large as possible. So above 20 centimeters is recommended in the manual. And it's just because the rigid body physics has difficulty with smaller objects. So the next thing that I'd like to talk about is these exploding cubes. So this is a bad practice, and I'll just demonstrate how I did it. So we should be using a proper collision margin and sensitivity to avoid it exploding, but I was just doing it for demonstration purposes. So if we untick that, it should be stacked properly. So this should be used rather than the split impulse to control these unwanted interactions. And the next quick tip is with this passive plane. So it has been keyframe animated, and that way we can rotate it and it still interacts with our other physics objects. So this is handy for animating like a bat or something to hit our stack of cubes. And so the next tip that I've seen people struggling with is copying animation data. If this one, so we'll just reset our keyframes. Let's just say we want to make this one dynamic only after frame 10. So we'll keyframe this off and then make it dynamic at frame 10. And so it's stuck there until frame 10. And now we want to copy that to all the other ones. If we select these and do copy from active, doesn't give us the results we expect, and that's because it's just copying this menu and that initial state of dynamic being turned off. So these are all stationary with it turned off, as you would expect now that you know that. So what we actually need to do is copy the animation data, and so one way to do this is select all of them, and with our first object that has the keyframes, so these don't have any keyframes, we need to press Ctrl L and link the animation data. So those keyframes are linked together now. This causes another issue where if this one is keyframed, so let's say we move it there and then we want to move it down back to here, keyframe 10, and well, that's not the result we wanted. So those other cubes still have their keyframes linked to our first object, so it's copying that exact position. So we can unlink that. Let's reset. So we need to unlink that animation data if we want to get around that. Select all of these objects, object, menu, relations, make single user, and we have all these options, but we just want object, the animation there, and selected objects. So those are now individual objects with their own keyframes. So if we do that again, move the object, it will behave as expected. Okay, so I was rushing through that and forgot the important property of the animated for our active type. So once we just keyframe that, it'll fix up our problem we're having. So just enable animated for these first 10 frames, and that should fix it up. Congratulations on reaching the end of the video. I hope you found it useful, and as I'm just starting out, any likes, comments and subscriptions are much appreciated. I'm interested to get your thoughts on these long form tutorials that really get into the nuts and bolts and multiple methods to do things. Thank you so much for dropping by, and I'll catch you next time.